left off was risk. So I'm going to do a quick review of where we're at with those aspects. So exposure is an information security. Exposure is a system configuration issue or mistake. So remember that in the definition of exposure, it is a technical aspect regarding a system configuration issue or a mistake in software. Likelihood, the weighted risk factor based on an analysis of the probability that a given threat is capable of exploiting a given vulnerability or a number of vulnerabilities. This is our heat map, the 5x5. Again, depending on how you want to qualify your ratings, you can do less or more depending on how much information you have to support and substantiate how you come to your ranking system. The impact, the keywords are magnitude of harm. Do not forget that. If you see magnitude of harm anywhere, you know it's talking about the impact from a threat that has exploited potentially a vulnerability. If you look at the verbiage on there, it talks about the consequences of unauthorized disclosure, which is talking about confidentiality, unauthorized modification, which is the integrity aspect, and then unauthorized destruction of information, which is also regarding the availability. So the CIAs are covered in the explicit definition of impact. Again, the 5x5, if you are to prioritize, of course, the upper right-hand quadrant is with where you would focus most of your attention from your resources and prioritization to address immediately. If you have a policy in the organization that depicts an extreme risk that has been identified and the catastrophic impact that you have potentially 10 days, 15 days to remediate at least down to a high risk and or a moderate risk level. And then at that point in time, you can take further action. But the initial action should be to mitigate that extremity of that particular risk to a more acceptable level of risk. And then the threats, again, are predefined topical areas that can be put into an organization. These can be anything in these categories, from human, natural, technical, environmental, and operational. As we said last week, from the natural perspective, if you take that out, a human entity can be involved in technical, environmental, and operational. The vulnerability is a weakness in your information system, your system security procedures, internal controls, or implementation that could be exploited by one of those threat sources. That brings us to where I believe we left off at, is the risk. So the potential that a given threat will exploit the vulnerabilities of an asset or a group of assets and thereby cause harm to the organization. Now, from the NIST definition, it's a little different, but generally the same. Risk is a measure of the extent to which an entity is threatened by a potential circumstance or event, meaning the threat, and is a typical function of, number one, the adverse impacts, again, the magnitude of harm, that would arise if the circumstances or the events, the threats, occur, and the likelihood of that occurrence. So it's taking into account both likelihood and impact in the definition, whereas in the ISO term, it's implying that you're talking about the threat and vulnerabilities of an asset or group of assets and thereby cause harm to the organization. It is implying that they've already taken into account the impact and the likelihood. And then our controls. There are two sets of controls that you need to be aware of. These definitions are from NIST. Talks about management, technical, and operational. If we were talking about ISO, it would be it would be administrative, physical, and technical. Technical is the same, but then physical and administrative would be your other controls. So if you see a question in your final exam and it talks about management or operational, it is deriving from NIST. I won't correlate or cross-reference management to an ISO definition. If it has management or operational controls, I am specifically talking about NIST. Good? Okay. Some of the security control classes that you need to be aware of, and these can be both either proactive or reactive in their model. And if you think about the defense in depth model and your target symbol and the multiple layers, the further out you can get, the better, because then you can be more proactive. And depending on where a potential, if you think again, the agile defense, that somebody's going to circumvent one or two of those controls, those can then provide you reactive timeframes before they actually get into your facility or logically into your systems. But they're somewhere out and about trying to get in, but you can see them. Those are going to be your most external control sets. Now, in those categories, we have directive, deterrent, preventative, compensating, detective, corrective, and recovery. And we shall go through those here. We'll go through those in a little bit, actually. But there are three of them that I want you to think about: preventative, corrective, and recovery. So you have detective in there as well, and preventative. If you think of your technical controls from an IDS or an IPS type system, the detective systems is explicitly that it detects. It sets off an alarm, and you can react accordingly to whatever those rules have been met to trigger the alarm for you. It doesn't stop whomever or whatever it is that's trying to breach your system. It doesn't stop it. It's just detective. It basically alerts you. A preventative control is going to prevent it from going further. You must configure it as such. Out of the box is going to default to a detective mode. So you have to physically, if it's a technical control, you must physically configure it appropriately for it to be a preventative control. That preventative control means if a set of rules is met, it's going to redirect it somewhere and or terminate the session. Depending on what your organization wants to do and where it's actually detected at, they might want to terminate the session. In other aspects, they might want to redirect it somewhere, so like to a honeypot area, to a DMZ area, whereas your security operations center can track it, can start playing a little cat and mouse counterintelligence game with it to determine and learn on the job, if you will, what and why they're there, what's trying to be circumvented, and they can practice their skills on redirecting, blocking, and investigating a particular source that has potentially breached your organization to an extent. Your corrective controls are going to be controls that are going to be implemented during an incident. A security incident has been reported, it's active. You're going to put corrective controls in place to minimize the impact of that said incident. And then recovery controls are only going to be deployed once the incident has been isolated and contained. You can only utilize recovery controls based on once the incident's over, you can do an assessment on with what damage, what impact has happened, and if there has been a loss of information or loss of systems and such, that's then when you would put in the recovery aspect of it. But you won't be able to do that until you've assessed the situation, your environment, to determine what has been impacted, what's been lost. Then, and only then, can you actually implement your recovery controls. Residual risk. So we've identified our threats, we've identified our vulnerabilities, we've identified likelihood and impact. If we calculate that out, that is our inherent risk level. Generally, it's going to be in that extreme category and or high risk area, just because we're not assessing controls yet. It's just the threats, The vulnerabilities for each, take one asset. Think the water bottle is one asset. All the threats that are posed towards that, any vulnerabilities that are open to that, and then the likelihood and impacts. And we gather a lot of that information from our incident management, other metrics and such, and from the business owners who own that particular device for total ownership, total cost of that device. Whereas then we have our inherent risk. Once we start assessing the controls that are in place, that will potentially reduce that inherent risk from that extreme factor down to a more acceptable level, maybe to the moderate, even to a low risk, based on the controls that are implemented today. Administrative, physical, and technical controls. Now, if it's still at a very high risk, now we need to identify what else can we do? What other countermeasures can we implement to apply to reduce that risk even further to that acceptable level? And again, if we have that policy that has a threshold, if we get below that threshold, we don't have to address it today. We can identify it and we can track it as a low risk moving forward, below the threshold risk moving forward. If and when you report your findings, your assessment findings to the risk owners and the business owners, try to present the inherent risk first. Let them know explicitly what those risks are and what the gravity of those risks are. Reason being, do you trust your controls? If you don't trust your controls that are implemented fully, wholeheartedly, that they're going to do what they're supposed to do at that optimal moment, the owners need to know what that inherent risk is going to be. It's a false sense of security to believe that your controls are 100%, that they're all working, that they'll block everything, they will eliminate any and all of the threats that we've identified, the vulnerabilities and such as that. There is the black swan out there, meaning there's a threat and a vulnerability that will rear its ugly head that we haven't noticed, we haven't identified, we haven't planned for, and it's going to breach, if you will, all of your controls in place because the controls you do have in place don't address those unknowns. That then is going to you're going to have an inherent risk issue because all of your controls will not apply. None of them will apply in that aspect. So residual risk is the risk rating after we reviewed all of the controls in place. But again, don't give yourself and the organization a false sense of security that we're secure because we have all these controls in place and they're all operational. That's great, and it's a good start, but again, there are unknowns that potentially will circumvent those controls and exploit those threats and vulnerabilities to the max capacity of that extreme risk and potentially be catastrophic to your organization. Now, a quick review for you all, and I'll run through these very quickly with the answers. A weighted risk factor based on analysis. We did this last week, didn't we? Not this one? Okay. Well, then we'll go through it. A weighted risk factor based on the analysis of the probability that a given threat is capable of exploiting a given vulnerability or set of vulnerabilities is F. That's not right. That's likelihood. It's B. That's wrong. Oh, 1 and 7 are transposed. I'm sorry. Yep. Number 1 and number 7 are transposed. 1 should be B. 7 is F. So don't forget that. Number 2, the current state after applying a risk response strategy is the residual risk. Number 3, the weakness in an information system, the system security procedures, internal controls, or implementation that could be exploited by a threat source is vulnerability. Number 4, the magnitude of harm. You can stop right there. If you remember it, it's impact. Exactly. Number 5, a system configuration issue or mistake. It's technical, it's exposure. Again, the system configuration issue or mistake in software. If you remembered those words, it should trigger the automatic exposure. Number 6, predefined topical areas which can put an organization at risk. Threats. 7 is going to be F, it's risk, so potential that a given threat will exploit the vulnerabilities of an asset or group of assets and thereby cause harm to the organization. It's risk, and that is the ISO terminology from the 2005 document, 27005 document. And then number 8, safeguards and countermeasures that are implemented to mitigate, lessen, and or to avoid a risk are the controls. Safeguards, countermeasures, synonymous with controls. So all 3 of those can be used interchangeably and such. Generally, countermeasures are additional controls applied to your baseline of controls. But if you do hear countermeasures, you should think of controls as a whole. Okay? All right, so now we're going to go into information risk management life cycle. So this is the process of what we're going to incorporate within risk management. 2 steps, a preparation step and the ongoing monitoring of the risk. With that, in NIST, there are 3 documents. I would recommend that you identify these 3 documents, memorize the nomenclature, and if you get a chance, you can go out onto the internet and download all 3 of these PDFs. They are free, and they are the basis of all NIST risk management and risk assessment processes. The federal government has mandated that any and all entities that fall under a government umbrella, federal government umbrella, must be compliant to the NIST FSMA risk management model. We'll talk about that much more starting next week. And you'll see these 3 documents throughout pretty much tonight's class and the next 2 classes actually, talking about all of the information regarding risk management and its life cycle. Now remember, this is the life cycle chapter, 800-37 Rev 1, Guide for Applying Risk Management Framework to Federal Information Systems, a Security Life Cycle Approach. It depicts explicitly how to incorporate this framework. It does call out it is for federal information systems. That's great. You can apply it to a nonprofit healthcare organization. You can apply it to a retail for-profit organization. You can apply it to any system. Any organization is very amenable, flexible to be implemented to support your program. If you have an ISO framework or a COBIT or COSO, whatever framework you have today, you can still utilize these documents to fill in some gaps, some opportunity areas that might not be addressed or are lacking in being addressed. So again, 3 good forms that you might want to use for your future reference in risk management. From a high level, the organization, again, what's your mission? What's the business processes? Those processes then will inform how our architects take into consideration, and the 3 documents that we just saw, how they need to apply appropriate controls in the design from conceptual design all the way through to production, moving into production, and utilizing the information security architecture as well to overlay be transparent to the enterprise architectural design of the application or system or infrastructure that's going to be put in place. Based on that, then, there's going to be information systems, multiple systems, that will fall under a particular organization. So an example of this, Department of Interior is a very large organization in the federal government. Within the Department of Interior, there are multiple other businesses, organizations that fall under as a parent-child type organization. The National Business Center that is here in Colorado, it's in Denver, that houses the majority of the Department of Interior systems. So there are major applications and there are minor applications. There are general support systems. Now some of the terminology is changing within those documents, but it's not finalized yet. But each system, each application has its own system, which then has its own controls to protect it appropriately based on the classification and categorization of that system, which we'll go into much more detail in next week's class. And again, the 4-phase model from 800-39. Assess, respond, monitor based on the framework. And we'll see more of this next week as well. And within the 4 phases, again, we're going to understand what is being assessed, how we're going to respond based on with what results have been presented, and then monitoring of those action items. So within that process, the third document is 800-30. Prepare for the assessment. So these are the 4 primary steps that you would execute for assessing any asset that your organization wants you to. And again, next week we'll actually start the assessment process, but I'll give you an overview of it today. Prepare for the assessment. So this is the kickoff meeting, discuss assumptions, constraints, time frames, priorities, trade-offs, and such as that. Then you go into the actual assessment. So we're going to, based on what credentials we've been given, what we're testing, what's in scope, if it's a technical assessment, if we're interviewing individuals, getting all that field data, and then with that laundry list of assets that are in scope, identify every threat for every asset on that list. Then, once you've done that particular task, you then identify all of the vulnerabilities to that particular asset that would then be mapped to with what threats could potentially exploit those vulnerabilities. So those first 2 steps are usually the heaviest and most time-consuming steps, because you have to identify the list of assets, all the threats to those, and then all the vulnerabilities that would be posed to that particular asset as well. Then we determine the likelihood of a particular threat exploiting any and all of those vulnerabilities. So if I have 50 threats for this one asset and I have 200 vulnerabilities, each of those threats, those 50 threats, I'm going to go through all 200 vulnerabilities and determine the likelihood and impact if it was to be realized for each one of those. So 1, 200 times. The second threat, 200 times. Third, 200 times. You can see how tedious that can become, and it is an extreme exercise to go through. But once you've done this, once you've executed this multiple times, which you will, you'll have a repository of known assets that are similar, a particular server, particular operating systems, particular applications running on those servers. You'll have known threats and you'll have known vulnerabilities for those. So the next assessment won't take nearly as long if you're starting from scratch. Now, we'll also talk about threat management and vulnerability management programs later as well. Those programs generally are responsible for identifying all the threats for all the assets, and they're going to provide that to you. You're going to work with them, and they're going to basically fill in the blank of all the threats and vulnerabilities where you don't have to do that, and it happens pretty much simultaneously because they already have your list of assets you're assessing. They're going to provide you the known threats, the known vulnerabilities, and based on their work as well, what's the likelihood and what's the impact? They've done all that hard work already. It's automated mostly, and they're also getting updates from their vendors, white papers, security papers, and such as that from multiple avenues to input into that particular database to backfill your assessment form. Then it's going to kick out and or spit out a risk level based on all the information that they've already captured. So you can see how critical it is for your organization to have a threat management and a vulnerability management program so they can help provide information for any and all assessments in the organization. Now, step 3 is communicating results, and you see the arrow is going multiple ways. So you as the assessing team are communicating back to the customer. The customer is also going to be communicating back with you based on the results that you're both talking about. So if I've identified a new threat or I've identified a new vulnerability and it's catastrophic, I'm going to communicate that based on our preparation from the preparement for the assessment, step 1. You as the customer might want to go do some hard work to get that resolved, remediated, eliminated at minimum below that threshold. And as I continue to do my formal assessment, you're going to come back in maybe a week and say, you know what, we did all these actions. It's mitigated to an acceptable level. Could you retest? If it's been vetted, we have time frame that we can go back and retest, we definitely will. And then our results should show that it is no longer an extreme risk. But that's where that communication comes into play. And then step 4, maintaining the assessment. That's maintaining once we've provided the report to the organization, we're maintaining the responses, we're maintaining a tracking list of all of the risks that are still present, being a residual risk and or any inherent risk and or low risks that are non-addressable, meaning they're just accepted because, again, they're below that threshold. Remember this particular diagram because you're going to look at, this is the NIST one. We're going to see the ISO one here shortly, and it looks fairly similar. So in the world out there, when you get out, it doesn't matter which framework you're utilizing because in general, they're the exact same thing. So if you look at the ISO term here, the ISO diagram on the far right, establish the context. And then you go straight down the line. Risk indicators, risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk treatment. And then you look at the third. If you're looking right here where my little mouse is going, you have communications and consultation. And on the right side, you have monitoring and reviewing. Now, let's go back one slide. Prepare for the assessment, step 1. Step 1 here, establishing the context. Step 2, the actual assessment. Risk identification. How do you do that? You have to identify your threats, your vulnerabilities, likelihood, magnitude of impact, determines the risk. So step 2 in the NIST process is all of it. In the ISO, it basically just goes through risk identification, which means implied. If you look at the 5.4.2 paragraph in the ISO 27005 document, it explicitly goes through this and what you're going to do. You have to identify your threats before you can do any analysis. What are the threats? What are the vulnerabilities? What's the likelihood? What's the impact? Once you've done that, now we go to the analysis of the risk. Oh, look at that. Determine the risk. So that's NIST's. Here's ISO. Then evaluate what that risk is. And then what's the treatment response? That is the communication portion of the NIST aspect of it. But here, additionally, we have communications and consultation. Okay, so we've got some issues. What are we going to do? Again, talking about what does the organization want to do with the risks that have been identified. Based on the evaluation, what are we going to do? Then we present those findings, and we monitor, and we review. We continuously monitor the program. We monitor all the action items for responses. We monitor risks that are still on the ledger, again, based on the threshold, so we don't lose track of those risks. But all in all, it is the same process. It just calls out terminology more specific in NIST. NIST is much more specific. It's much more procedural guidance, if you will, on what you need to do. In the ISO terminology, in the diagram, it's a lot more high level, but it calls out where the paragraphs are that you can go back and look and see with what is explicitly asked for, and it will tell you all these pieces. The diagram in NIST goes into more detail. Diagram in ISO is a little more general. So for nonprofit organizations or for private organizations, generally the ISO framework is an easier sell because it's not so specific. It's not challenged as much because the audience doesn't really know what you're doing. You're telling them, I'm going to identify your risks. Okay. But it doesn't go through the process of how you're going to do it. It does in the detail of the diagram or the documentation, but in the diagram, it's just high level. Most private organizations kind of like that because it's not telling them explicitly, and they don't they don't feel constrained to it. Whereas in NIST, it's a government document. You're going to do this. There's no question. You will do it. So they don't mind being very directive, very specific on those tasks, specified tasks. ISO, it's more implied. But they're the same. They are literally the same process. A few other approaches for that aspect. High trust, geared towards your healthcare. ITIL. If you have ITIL or have gone through the process to become an ITIL organization, it takes a lot of time, a lot of patience, and a lot of resources to get to that point. However, it is a very modular type framework to follow, and it does work for any organization as long as the organization buys in that that's what we're going to do. So I'll give you an example of incident management. If an incident happens in an ITIL modeled framework in that assessment with your controls and such, if it's never happened again, it's an unknown event. It's an incident. However, once that incident has happened, based on who and how the organization has reacted to that incident, during the incident, they're actually documenting what happened, how it happened, what was the response. This is how we want to respond to this in the future. It then becomes a known event, which becomes operational. So we're going to create a procedure to handle that particular incident. And then in the future, if it ever happens again, it's a known event. There's a process to handle it. It now goes from incident to operational task. It's expansion. It continues to evolve through with what happens at your organization. So it definitely provides a maturity model for you, because the more incidents you have today, the more processes you're going to have to address those in the future. So it is a good model. It does take time. It's very expensive. And you also have to train your entire staff on how to implement and support all of the modules within ITIL. And then a couple more. And then you will have to participate in risk management activities, and that we'll be talking about more so in the actual assessment, but from the risk management perspective. Your security program must encompass the governance. Remember, information governance. It's not management. You're governing information. Compliance management, risk management, enterprise security programs, all of those encompassed is your risk management program, enterprise risk management. You might have separate entities, you might have centralized, decentralized, or that hybrid model in place, but all in all, you're going to devise a system development lifecycle. Based on concepts, you're going to have your architects apply the appropriate standards in any and all designs. You will then overlay your information security architectural design to be transparent to the needs of the organization, but securing each of those aspects as it goes through design and development. And then once it goes to production, it's already secured appropriately. It has auditing involved. It has all the pieces that are needed, required, to ensure the protection of any sensitive information in that particular instant. You also have merger and acquisition, so organizations that purchase other organizations or merge with them. You acquire other organizations. So before you actually start working together, you want to understand both atmospheres, environments, cultures, technology standards, because there might be some vulnerabilities in the acquired organization that you don't want to introduce to your organization. So we have to come up with a model of how to bring on the acquired organization without introducing new or grave risks to the entire organization. And then capital planning and investment. What are you going to do today? What are we doing next year, 3 years, 5 years? And what's that model going to look like? How are we going to fund those models moving towards that 3 to 5 year plan? Is it purchasing controls, purchasing assets, or are you going to lease them with a 2-year, 3-year life cycle, and every 2 to 3 years you start doing a revamp, exchange out, so we have the latest, greatest technology being implemented. 2 years in certain aspects can be very old. Look at your phones. You buy a brand new phone today, there's a new one tomorrow. You're already outdated. There's other equipment that you can buy today that will be relevant for next 5 years. So you have to plan appropriately how you're going to offset those costs and utilize the funding, either capital funding or operational funding. Another piece of your action items in the risk management is to determine what your remediation action plans are. When you assess those controls from the inherent risk perspective before you get the residual risk, we need to, and again, this is where you can, if you can, present the inherent risk to the organization so they understand what they're dealing with. Because then when you actually do assess the controls, you're going to be assessing, was the control or controls implemented correctly? Are the controls operating as intended? And are those controls producing the desired results that the control objectives are supposed to be providing your organization? If you have third parties providing controls, you need to assess the third party and how they do this as well, to understand, again, the entire encompassing information that must be protected appropriately because it's your information. A few names that the remediation plan can use from the NIST and the government aspect, it'll be Plan of Actions and Milestones. Acronym is POAMs. So if you are in the government's realm, you will get to know POAMs intensely. Corrective action plans, that's what Kaiser uses, and then remediation plans, other organizations I've worked with utilize those as well. So you call it whatever you want to call it. Best practices, government is going to use Plan of Actions and Milestones, POAMs. Private industries and such as that, corrective action, remediation plans, response plans, they can be any of those. So it's on you as an organization to determine what that taxonomy is and then disseminate that information to all the organization and owners, business owners, risk owners, so they understand with what you're talking about. Within NIST and within ISO, we have guidance. The NIST documentation is free and it's generally guidance for you to follow. However, when the government stated that the government is going to use NIST as its framework, the guidelines became requirements. If you're a nonprofit or if you're a for-profit organization that's not under the government entity or umbrella, then the NIST documentation can be used as a guideline. It can be used to fill in those gaps of your current framework. In an audit or an assessment, guidelines are non-enforceable. They're just that. They're guidance. And they're non-enforceable. So if I didn't follow the guidance, there's no harm on it. Unless it was depicted, mandated, and or documented that we're going to, like the government said. Otherwise, it's guidance. If it's a requirement and I didn't follow it, now it's enforceable. Now I could be punished. Potentially loss, termination of employment because I've blatantly, maliciously, if you will, violated the requirement, disregarded the requirement, did not adhere to the requirement. So again, guidelines are non-enforceable, requirements are enforceable. Now that 800-37 guidance, so if you remember, that is the life cycle to risk management. It's Rev 1, and if you look online, it's Revision 1. It is a 6-step process, and it goes through the life cycle explicitly. Previously, there was a certification and accreditation process. Every 3 years, the government would assess a particular system. It's a snapshot in time and determine its risk at that point in time, and then it wouldn't look at it again for another 3 years. Well, that was viewed as A, very risky, and B, very costly every 3 years. So what the government has done is move to a continuous monitoring program, continuously assessing and authorizing its systems. It's still a 3-year cycle, but it's changed. Let's go through that quickly. So if I own an application, I'm a risk owner, I'm a business owner. In the government's perspective, I would be an authorizing official. I would own a system. Step one is to categorize that particular system. It would either be a general support system, a major application, or a minor application. Based on all the information that it's creating, receiving, transporting, and such, based on the sensitivity of that information. The documents FIPS 199 and the special publication 800-60 are reference materials for that particular step. It'll help me determine explicitly what my system should be categorized as. Once I've gone through that, and again, as it'll tell me explicitly, if it has these, it is this type of application, major application, or a general support system or such. So let's take it as a major application, meaning it's a critical application to the government. We go to step 2. We go to security controls. We're going to select them. We're going to use the FIPS 200 document and the special publication 800-53 Rev 4, Revision 4 document. And based on the categorization of the system, and you open up the actual SP 800-53, it tells you explicitly if it's a low system, medium system, high system, based on risk, what controls must be implemented for that particular system. There's no guessing. There's no, well, I don't think I'm going to do that. It tells you what you must implement. If you have a major application and it's a high risk or application or system, you're generally going to apply all of the controls because that far right column is going to be checked. And you're going to have to go through every one of those and implement every single one of those. But step 2 is to select which ones. You physically don't have to select them because it's already been done for you by the government. You just need to go and look at it with what they are and then move right to step 3. Now I need to implement them. There is a document, the SP 800-160, that helps provide supplemental guidance, as does the 800-53 Rev 4. It gives you supplemental guidance on how to implement those particular controls. It doesn't go into the great detail of how to, but it gives you it reads where you can, your perception is basically 9/10 of the law of how you're going to implement those controls. In the controls themselves, in the step 2, the 800-53 Rev 4, it tells you what the control objective is. So when you implement, we need to make sure that that control objective is being met, that it's doing with what it's supposed to do. The desired outcome will be met once it's implemented. You then implement, and then you guess what? You get to go assess those particular controls. There's another document for guidance. It's called the SP 853 Alpha, which tells you how to assess each of those controls that you just identified in step 2. So again, if you don't have a risk management framework in place today, this, I guess, triad of documentation can and will set you up for success if you follow it and implement it appropriately. So we assess, you're going to have basically 4 different responses. Fully implemented, partially implemented, not implemented, planned to be implemented, and or not planned, I guess, if you will. So there might be 5, but 4 generally. Fully implemented, partially implemented, not implemented, planned to be implemented. Those are going to be in the assessment per check block of every control that has been applied that was identified in your categorization systems, what's being assessed. Now, one more new step to that, which is also part of step 6. In the assessment process, there are alpha controls, there are Bravo controls, and there are Charlie controls. The alpha controls are the priority controls. They're the big hitters. They are assessed annually, continuously, but they're assessed annually. So every year of that 3-year cycle, you're going to assess those alpha controls. Every second year, you're going to assess the Bravo controls. So not the first year, but the second year you will. Not the third year, but the fourth year you would assess those again. And then that last year of that 3-year cycle, you would then assess your alpha controls and your Charlie controls. The lesser controls, if you will. Those are going to be assessed in the third year, not the first 2 years, only the third year of that cycle. The alpha controls are assessed all 3 years. Bravo controls the second year, only the second year. And the Charlie controls only the third year, on top of the alpha controls. We then take the security assessment report. We also take the system security plan. We take the POAMs, Plan of Action and Milestones, which is the remediation mitigation plans, and we bring those to our authorizing official, and we present them to that particular individual who owns that particular system and request an authorization to operate, an ATO. Within that ATO then, that individual is going to review what the assessment looks like, what findings are still out there, what critical risks we might have, prioritized, all the POAMs that have been depicted, all the POAMs that are closed, that have been closed for the 3-year cycle, what's still open, and then they're going to determine whether or not they're going to provide an authorization to operate. Every system in the government must have an ATO, and it's a 3-year cycle still, so certification and authorization now. Within that, there might be conditions, so a conditional ATO, meaning there's a critical risk that's in the midst of being mitigated, but it isn't fully mitigated yet, and it wasn't able to be mitigated before the actual time to present to the authorizing official. It then goes through a condition, and the authorizing official will say, I'll give you an ATO with conditions. You must mitigate this control the next 30 days. Provide me an update in 30 days on where you're at with that, and then we'll revisit. In 30 days, hopefully you have mitigated it to the acceptable level, and the conditional piece comes off, and you have a stamp of approval, authorization to operate for the next 3 years. That documentation then goes into its repository, technical repository, and all the assets in that system funnel up to step 6, into the continuous monitoring document, into the penetration testing, vulnerability testing, threat management program, continually monitoring all of those assets for threats, for vulnerabilities, any issues. And as we go through all year long, while we're going through the assessment process of those alpha controls, if anything is realized or identified, we mitigate it. It's continually monitoring, continuously improving your security posture. You're always assessing and you're always fixing for the 3-year cycle. Does that make sense? So then when you get to the end of the year, guess what? You're done. You've been doing everything. Every month, you're basically doing a 10%. So just take 50 controls for my alpha controls. Of those 50, I take 10% every month. In 10 months, guess what? I'm at 100%. I finalize anything I need for those final 2 months. And then by the end of the year, I'm at 100% or potentially at 120% of assessing all of my controls, having my security assessment report done, having my system security plans updated, and just following that 10% model. 10% every month. In 10 months, I'm at 100%. Final 2 months, I wrap up documents, update documentation, and post it, and I'm good to go for the next year. And I can prepare myself basically for the next 10%, the next month, if you will. So if I use the calendar year, January through October, I'm assessing 10% of all those controls, alpha. And then also if it's a second year cycle, alpha and bravo. So if I have 10% of my alpha and 10% of my bravo controls in January, all the way through to October, I'm done. November, December, I wrap up all the information, anything else, anything that we need to mitigate, anything that we need to address if it's critical. We still have 2 months in the calendar year to resolve those before the new year, the new fiscal year starts, or calendar year starts, and that we start assessing alphas and Charlies. And that's just how the program works. It can be pretty monotonous because every change that happens in the infrastructure potentially causes a change in categorization, potentially change in controls that have been selected, how they're implemented, and then you have to go back and reassess. So this is ongoing. It never stops. It's not boring because you see new things every day. Nothing is ever the same. It's always changing because technology changes all the time. And as I said, 800-53 reference documentations, and you can use those references for basically identifying the controls and how to implement those controls with supplemental guidance, and also how to assess those controls. These are just some examples. You do not need to worry about these for your final exam. The CA1, this is a control itself, talks about the security assessment and authorization policy and procedures. It's a control. The objective of the control is this control addresses the establishment of a policy and procedure for the effective implementation of a selected security control and control enhancements. So do you have an assessment and authorization policy? Do you have procedures for it? Yes. Show me proof. Give me the documentation. And I look like your policy assignment. Effective date, expiration date, revisions, who signed off on it, what's their level, what's the purpose, what's the scope, who's the audience, and what are the parameters of that. I look at that, and then I'm going to go see if there's any incidents or if there's any other issues or anything that can support that this document wasn't just fabricated, backdated, or such, that it's actually in place, if there's training on it. If so, if you say yes, great. Where's your learning management system, your LMS? I want to download and see who's taking this training. Is it mandatory? If it is, then there should be 100%. If it's not mandatory, don't say it's mandatory. If it is, you better make sure that everybody's taking it. Because if you say it's mandated and you only have 10% of people that have taken it, guess what? You have a gap. It's mandated, but you aren't doing your due diligence of it. And then second, -2 is the actual assessment, plan of actions and milestones, and then continuous monitoring. So these are controls that are assessed by the government in every system. So you must have all of these in place. And then project management or program management, it also has, these are brand new controls that came out just a couple years ago. So do you have an information security program plan, the system security plan to support a particular system? And as the ISO documentation is, it's the information security management system. What's the program? What's identified in it, roles and responsibilities, such as that. Again, plan of actions and milestones process. How do you do it? And then the information security measures of performance, key performance indicators, key risk indicators that you're tracking, metrics on how well this program is actually working. What's your strategy? So again, you have controls that are being assessed based on just with what you're supposed to have in place. Then we go to the risk treatment. So this goes back to our communication portion and monitoring of the diagrams for both NIST and ISO. Within that treatment, once risks have been identified, you're going to get a response. And if you look at the bottom, we have the acceptance, the avoidance, mitigation, and or sharing transfer discussion. Again, if we accept it, if your organization has a policy that has a threshold, that helps everybody. Doesn't mean that you're going to be not risky. It just means that you have a policy that says, I don't have to address those. They're low, they don't have to be addressed. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying it's bad. It just helps everybody if you have a policy that depicts with what the organization is going to do. Otherwise, you're leaving up to every individual to determine what they're going to do with that response. If you trust your leadership, great. If you're not too sure about it, you might want to implement a policy. The risks that will be presented will have a response. The response will be, I will accept it based on the policy because it's low. I will avoid it. I'm not going to introduce that solution in the organization. I'm not going to put that risk in the organization. I'm going to avoid it wholeheartedly and go to a new solution. I'm going to mitigate it because it's above the threshold of the policy, and I must mitigate it to the acceptable levels below the threshold. You know what? I'm gonna share that with my buddy over here. I think we both own that particular risk. Great. You have to get both parties together. Both have to agree that they're going to share it, and then you're going to ask, what are you guys going to do? You're going to accept it, you're going to avoid it, or you're going to mitigate it. And if I transfer the risk, where's it being transferred? When? What does that mean? And is whoever you're transferring the risk to, are they going to mitigate? Are they going to accept? Are they going to avoid the risk? So there's follow-on actions based on a transfer or sharing of said risk. It doesn't go away. You must discuss it further with the other parties that are involved with that decision. Then the mitigation and or remediation. So based on the response, we're going to mitigate. It's above, the risk is above the threshold. We need to identify what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, when we're going to do it, what's it going to cost, what's the timeline, and then we basically create a project. Who's our project manager that's going to lead it? Who are the team members that need to be involved? What's all required from logistics, resources, and such? How much time do we have based on the criticality of the risk? And then we start implementing controls. We start implementing countermeasures. We start mitigating the risk and tracking it and reporting back, communicating, step 3, communicating all those aspects based on the monitoring of that risk until it's mitigated and or eliminated from the organization. Talked about transfer and sharing, avoidance we've talked about, acceptance we've talked about. Communications, again, it should be, from an organization perspective, top down, bottom up, and lateral. Any and all information from a security perspective should be continually communicated so everybody knows what you're doing and why you're doing it. Because when you don't communicate and something new comes out and it has a negative impact to the organization, and then they find out it's you, security, or risk management, or privacy, you get a bad rap because you're hiding something. You're doing something that nobody knew about. So you must be transparent. You've got to share it. And if you're in a culture that has what's the right word, that the organization must approve, if you will, with what you're doing, consensus, 100% consensus, or a democratic vote of majority rules, then you need to get agreement. You must go out and sell it. You must obtain approvals from everybody to get the consensus of it before it can go into action. A good way to do that is submit documentation or send out information to gather input from your stakeholders who you need to get consensus from, get their voice, get their input, incorporate it because it's now their voice in whatever that is that you're trying to accomplish. And then when they go to review it, they're going to see their words in that document and they own it. And if you do get feedback from people, identify them in a paragraph of saying, We want to say thank you to these individuals or groups that actively participated and provided feedback and guidance and documentation and support and whatever else to the final product. Make it theirs, not yours, theirs. If you make it their document, their project that you're basically running for them, you have a much better chance of it being approved and getting the consensus that you need to take action moving forward. So communicate, key. Now with your policies, with your actions, with what the organization must do, there are cases where you have organizations, sub-organizations, that can't meet the policy, that are non-compliant. They need to have an exception to the policy. We don't want to broadcast that, but there are going to be true cases, business cases, where organizations will not be able to meet the policy. So that last statement there, except in very rare cases, entities with an organization will need relief from the policy. So if they're assessed or audited, they're going to, oh, you guys aren't compliant. You're right. However, I have an exception approval based on these criteria. And now you will not have an audit finding because you have an exception to the policy. Some of those examples, think of an operating room in an ER. If the doctor is utilizing a computer, you don't want your screen lock policy to kick in. After 2 minutes of non-use on that particular device, poof, all of a sudden you have a locked screen. Nobody remembers the password. We're in a critical crunch time. Life or death time is relevant. I don't want somebody trying to remember what a password is. That is a great opportunity to have an exception. Air traffic control, TV news anchor, other examples like that, that maybe a screen lock policy is not in the best interest of the organization at that particular moment. So they would have exceptions. Generally, exceptions are only good for a maximum of 12 months. In certain cases, like the operating room, that might just be a reoccurring forever and ever. It just depends. But generally, an exception should only be a maximum time of 1 year, whereas then in 6 months, send out a reminder, hey, you have an exception that will expire in 6 months, 90 days, 60 days, 30 days. And it's not on you, but it's on the organization to come up with a solution to alleviate that exception. Now, generally, the organization is not going to do anything because they already have an exception. That's why you don't want to give them one unless they really need it. But if they do have one, even though it's not your responsibility, if you want to get rid of that exception, you're probably going to have to work for them, with them, to alleviate that exception. Help them find a new solution because they're not going to, generally. They're just going to leave it go, and it'll expire. Well, you should give me a new one then. And it goes to ownership. Unless your organization is very strong in ownership, you might have exceptions that run forever. We don't want that, but it does happen. Reporting and metrics are critical because it shows your value. It shows where you are today, and you can baseline improvements and reductions in incidents, in reduction in risks, reduction in impact of vulnerabilities that have been exploited. So you want to show reduction of pieces and improvement on education, improvement on reporting of incidents, improvement on value add of your program. Both NIST and ISO, they want to and they do measure for effectiveness of the controls, the measurement of the efficiency of the controls, and then the impact that the organization is exposed to if and when an incident has occurred. Hopefully, if they have the appropriate controls in place, then they are effective and they are efficient. The impact is going to be minimal. Then efficiency and impact measures, again, from an ISO perspective, the 27004 is a document that houses what metrics you should be utilizing. So if you are looking for metrics, definitely check out the 27004 document. Key performance indicators, again, are on your program. It provides a loop for your organization to provide you feedback on how well or opportunities you might have to improve your organization, to improve your efficiency of the program, improve the effectiveness of the program, and to improve overall risk posture of your security program. That, I believe, is it. Are there any questions? That's it. We're done. Next week. Not done. Okay, good. So next week's class, we will dive into risk assessments, and we'll be doing that for the next 2 weeks. So next week, and then Halloween. We'll finish early on Halloween, so everybody can go out and have fun. As long as you bring me candy the next week, that's fine. And I'll get those classes loaded this week, so you'll have them so you can look at it for next week. And yeah, that's it. That's the last things we do, and then we'll come. Then we have, that'll be November 6th, something like that. And then, yeah. And then the Monday before Thanksgiving, we will all go on a little physical tour. As long as it's not snowing, 500-mile-an-hour winds that we're having like today. Otherwise, we'll just do an inside tour. We've still got plenty of controls inside that we can look at too from a physical perspective. And then we will have no class after Thanksgiving. We'll do review, and then you have your final, and then you're done. And you get full credit because we're going to get you enrolled. We're done now.